Hello, listeners and followers of Amo Africa. Thank you for being here today. This week, we have a wonderful guest, and our interview today is with Fatima Derby. Fatima B. Derby, pronounced she, they, is a queer African feminist writer, communications consultant, and community organizer based in Accra, Ghana. Fatima is an editor and contributing writer on the award-winning blog Adventures from the Bedrooms of African Women, where she writes about sex and body politics from a feminist perspective. If you guys are not familiar with Adventures From, you should definitely check them out. They do amazing work, and I know because I am testament to that kind of work. Their written work documenting feminist and queer organizing strategies in Africa has been published in the Women in Islam Journal, issue 5, 2021, by Strategic Initiative for Women in the Horn of Africa, SIHA, and the Feminist Realities digital magazine by the Association for Women's Rights in Development, AWID. As part of their feminist activism, Fatima co-organizes the Young Feminist Collective in Accra to discuss and organize around women's rights and social justice. She is also a co-founding member of The Gathering, an LGBTQ women's space in Accra to collectively unpack and navigate queer identities and experiences in ways that are empowering and restorative. Thank you so much for joining us, Fatima. How are you today?
Hi, Ami. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here. I'm feeling great. I am. How are you?
Thank you so much. And I did forget to introduce myself. My name is Ami Tamakloe. You may be familiar with me. I'm usually on the bonus episodes, but today I am here today with this amazing human to have a very important conversation. So let's get right into it. So Fatima, how did you get into working with Adventures From? And an even broader question, what led you into community organizing and advocacy, especially around issues of gender and sexuality?
I would say that my activism journey, and I consider my job at Adventures as part of my activism journey. I would say that it began in full momentum in 2018. And I always mention this other amazing, vibrant feminist organization in Ghana. They're called Drama Queens. They name themselves as a Pan-African feminist theater group, but they do so much more than just theater. They run workshops, they do a lot of feminist organizing, they do a lot of community building. So I followed them on Instagram for the longest time. And in 2018, they were running a film making workshop. They called it Queer Universities. And it was basically a workshop to train writers and upcoming filmmakers on like how to make film, specifically how to write and make film, specifically for activism. And so it was a 5-day workshop. I think they had like all kinds of resource persons. There was like activities and things like that. So I applied to join the program because for the first time in my life, I was like out of school and I was working and I kind of like, it's that thing of like your life is in your hands and you can choose where you want to go. I wasn't like living with my parents at the time. So I was like, I want to do feminist activism, right? At the time, I want to do feminist activism and like this is a chance for me to do that. And so when I was joining queer universities, I was like, oh, okay, well, I'm joining to learn how to write and do film for activism. But at that time, I was thinking very critically around issues of gender and sexuality. But I don't think I had quite like made the link, right, between those two things. And I was aware of the intersections, but not like from a very deep political context, right? And so I found myself in that workshop and I got connected to the activist community in Accra. And it was through that I met Nana Chiama, who is the co-founder of Adventures from the Bedrooms of African Women, and also the author of the book, The Sex Lives of African Women. So I had met Nana Dakwa through the Drama Queen workshop, and I was like, hey Nana, I'm like, I'm young and I'm fresh and I'm trying to get into like activist things, but like I need a feminist mentor. So like, would you mentor me? And she was like, yeah, sure. Of course. So she would send me links, ask me to apply for stuff, and that's what I was doing. And then eventually when an opening came, an adventure. She sent me the link. She wasn't even sending it to me. She was saying, "Oh, can you send this around your network? We're looking for somebody to do communications for us." And I'm like, I would like to apply for the role myself. And then she was like, "Well, okay, sure." So I applied. I did the interview, and I got in. And this was in 2019. So I've been working with Adventures since 2019. In that time, I have been part of supporting the Adventures Live Festival, which is an annual festival that we run. We have panel conversations, workshops, art exhibitions, just to talk around issues of sex, sexuality, intimacy, and pleasure. So I've done that since 2019. I also supported production of the Adventures podcast for season one, which was released last year. I supported editing on the blog and just like any other initiative that comes through. And so for me, being part of, the Adventures team and specifically with organizing the festival, it also required me to be really involved, right, in the community, with the community, because you're organizing an event, you're trying to invite people to be panelists, to be participants. You need to like reach out, do lots of outreach to like other organizations, like grassroots organizations in Accra. And so that's how come like I kind of like really threw myself into it. And I just been like, I was called for this work and I'm doing it.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. It's such a wonderful feeling to be doing something and find fulfillment in that, something meaningful. And so from your description of it, you just wanted to learn, and now it's pretty much a big part of your life right now, which is amazing. So now let's move into like the hot topic at hand. BBC published an article on 31st March saying there are currently 64 countries with laws that criminalize queerness/homosexuality. And in March of this year, queer communities, especially on the continent of Africa, went wild because Uganda's parliament passed an anti-LGBTQ bill. And you and I are both from Ghana, and we know Ghana has been perambulating around this issue. I just held myself from using a language that might not be appropriate, but Ghana has been perambulating around this similar issue too, since it shut down the LGBT Community Center meant to provide support and services to queer folks in Ghana in 2021, correct? This happened was it 2020 or 2021? Do you remember?
It was in 2020 was when the 2021 was when it was shut down, and then talking the bill happened.
Oh, yes.
August,
yes.
That year.
Yeah, so 2021. Awesome. So now the question is, have you had the opportunity to go through either Uganda or Ghana's bill yet? Have you been able to do that?
I have, but I would like for you to go through the provisions, because I wanted to chime in something else about like the similarities, right, between the two bills.
Absolutely. So I'm going to go over some of the provisions in the bill, and an article that was written for Adventures from African Bedrooms of African Women. We broke down some of the provisions in the Uganda bill. So the bill describes the offense of homosexuality in Clause 2 as performing a sexual act on another person of the same gender or allowing a person of the same gender to perform a sexual act on you. This current bill, irrespective of its amendment, carries extreme penalties, and some of the provisions are: 1, punishment for anyone who identifies outside the male-female binaries. 2, false sexual allegations. So a person who falsely accuses another of committing homosexuality is liable to imprisonment for up to a year. A person who knows or has reason to believe a person has committed or intends to commit the offense of homosexuality and does not report it will either pay a fine or be jailed for 6 months. If a person suspects a person has committed homosexuality or intends to commit, must report to anyone who suspects someone has to report to the police. People convicted of homosexuality will be required to disclose their records to agencies and institutions that deal with vulnerable populations, such as children, if they are intending to occupy a position of authority. So this is under the disclosure of sexual offenses record. People who are convicted of homosexuality will lose their jobs if they work with children or other vulnerable populations. So there's a disqualification from employment upon conviction. If a person permits LGBTQ people to use their facilities for homosexual acts, in air quotations, that are people like homeowners, landlords, families in compound houses, etc., they will be held liable and will be punished by fine and might lose their license of operation if this is like a commercial space. So this is under the promotion of homosexuality clause, how it implicates other people. And clause 6 in Uganda's bill says consent to sexual act is no defense. The consent of a person to commit a sexual act shall not constitute a defense to a charge under this act. So the biggest thing that people have been pushing about is consent. Sexual interactions or sexual engagements with consent are not recognized. So irrespective of it being between two or more consenting adults, this act does not recognize that. Now, for children under 18 years, if you are convicted, you should be liable for up to 3 years imprisonment. However, it does not address what happens if the child turns 18 while imprisoned, because in Uganda, the legal age is still 18. So there's also a continuation which says the committing of aggravated homosexuality is liable on conviction to suffer death. One part of it says life imprisonment. So they contradict themselves within the provisions in the bill. But these are some of the provisions that the Uganda bill has made. For the bill in Ghana, which is entitled Promotion of Proper Human Sexual Rights in Ghanaian Family Values Act, filed in 2021, the preliminary provisions of this act applies to A, people who hold out as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, transsexual, queer, an ally, a pansexual, or a person of any other social cultural notion of sex or sexual relationship that is contrary to the social cultural notions of male and female or the relationship between males and females. B, someone questioning the sexuality of that person. C, someone who has a biological anomaly, including a person who is intersex. D, someone involved in the promotion of, propagation of, advocacy for, supporting or funding of LGBTQIAP+. E, provides or participates in provision of sex or gender reassignment, surgical procedure, or any other procedure intended to create a sexual category other than the sexual category of a person assigned at birth, except where the procedure is intended to correct a biological anomaly, including intersex, or F, a person who engages in a sexual activity prohibited under this act. Whew, that was a very lengthy preliminary provision that this bill makes. Fatima, what are your thoughts on both of some of these provisions the bill make?
Oh, first of all, it's absolutely absurd and very, very ridiculous. The provisions in the bill. There's so many things that are happening in both bills, right? So there is serious privacy issues because basically the state is literally making its business to be involved in what people's privacies, right? Whatever you're doing in your bedroom, there's that. There's also a heavy surveillance happening, right? Because when you tell people they have a duty to report somebody for seeming or being queer, right? So it means that everybody's watching everybody. For the bill in Ghana, there's actually a provision that tries to criminalize sympathy, saying that if you sympathize with LGBTQI plus folks, you are also guilty of a misdemeanor, right? So it's like different things that are happening. There are lots of similarities also in these two bills. And so for me, it gives you pause and then you wonder where this bill is coming from and why is the language so similar? They're pushing for the same things. The justification is like very similar. The Ugandan bill and the Ghanaian bill, first of all, is trying to prevent self-determination. Basically saying people cannot, on their own, say I'm gay or I'm lesbian, like cannot define themselves or identify in a specific way. And then the justification that they give, they say they're trying to protect children, which is very weird to me because if you were really trying to protect children, it's not by criminalizing homosexuality, it is actually by checking sexual violence in schools. In Ghana, they rejected the including comprehensive sexuality education into the school curriculum, right? And when you look into what the comprehensive sexuality education is, it's just basically about like having children learn about their body parts, knowing what is what. It's things about consent. It's things about hygiene, right, and things like that, right? It's basically stuff that kind of like prevents sexual violence or allows children to know what's wrong and give them the language to report or to say that something is wrong, right? But then that gets rejected. And then instead, what we are seeing is this bill. And then in Uganda, I think was this yesterday or 2 days ago, BBC had released this report again about sexual assault, like cases rising in Uganda. And so it's like if the problem really is about protecting children, why are we not having laws and policies to actually protect kids? Why are we not trying to empower children with information and with language? Why are we not promoting consent education? Why is the bill kind of like the solution to that? So there's that stuff happening. And then there's also the claim that they're trying to protect traditional and cultural beliefs or values, which again is just plain wrong. Because even in the most traditional areas, if you go to the most remote places in Ghana, where people exist, and the funniest part is it's not even a problem, right? It's a part of life. It's a thing that we know, like, oh, this person, their gender expression is quite different from other people who look like them. And that's just what it is, right? Even to the point where in our local languages, there are even names, right, for people like for effeminate men and for masculine women, and like all kinds of people who subvert the gender binary. So again, it's just not accurate to say homosexuality is against our culture, and so this bill is to protect culture, right? So those are the things that are happening, with the Ugandan bill and with the Ghanaian bill, and even more so, again, on a broader perspective, right? Prior to all of these bills being introduced, there have been all kinds of like violence or violent things that have happened before the introduction of the bills. So in Uganda, I think was it last year or so, an LGBTQ community shelter was raided by the police, similar to what had happened in Ghana, where the first community center was also raided by the police and shut down. So it's like the state has been involved, right, in actively making sure that queer people face violence. And then it's like now they're taking it one step further to kind of like codify this violence and then blame people for it to say, well, you deserve your violence because you're gay, right? So these are all of the different things that are happening. But I think for me, the most jarring thing about all of it is how they claim that they're trying to enforce some kind of African cultural value. But then you look at the language of the bill and like, it's not even African. Like, what do you mean when you say that you're trying to preserve a family that is made up of a man, a woman, and a children, like a cis heteropatriarchal unit? That's just not even how, like, we understand family in many of our African societies. People people are raised with just their mothers, in single mom homes. Some people are raised with only women. It's you, your mother, your auntie, your grandmother, your great grandmother. There are no men anywhere around, right? So there are those kinds of families. There's also people who are raised with, uncles or aunties. So I'm a fancy. And my mother keeps telling me multiple times to not refer to my cousins as my cousins. They're my siblings because we're from the same bloodline. So even the way that we conceptualize the idea of family is not, it's very, very different from, Western conceptualizations of family. And so if we have a bill saying that we're trying to protect African culture or African values, and then the so-called African values that are being spelled out are things that are actually foreign to the African values that we grew up with, then what are you really saying? And so yeah. So these are the issues, really. These are really the issues.
Yeah. Yeah. Another thing is, just adding to that, I know that the bill contradicts itself in so many aspects, and then it does a really fine job of dehumanizing people or members of the queer community. So I'm going to pull on Ghana's bill on the second provision. Provision number 7 says procuration, which essentially talks about people. Let me use the language that they use. A person who by threat or intimidation procures another person to engage in a sexual activity prohibited under this act, or by false pretense or false representation procures another person to engage in a sexual activity prohibited under this act. Now, what does that mean? Like, you're talking about pimps, you're talking about sex slaves. What has homosexuality or being queer have to do with being a sex slave? Being a sex slave is one thing. Having a pimp is another thing, but they propagate this idea that queer people are, what's the word they even use? Oh my goodness, why am I blanking out on this word? Recruiting. Yes, that's the word they use. Recruiting young people, that queer people recruit other people to be queer. And I'm like, dude, your priorities are all over the place, because there are pimps who are, using people. There are people who are in sex slavery, and it has little to do with queerness. And then they talk about detention. Detention, a person who detains another person with intent to cause that person to engage in sexual activity prohibited under this act commits an offense and is liable. That isn't this sexual assault? Isn't this rape? You're detaining someone to commit sexual activity with them. Detention automatically means a lack of consent. And when there's lack of consent, depending on the age range, it's either rape or defilement. And Ghana's constitution already has provisions to deal with rape and defilement, unless they're saying that the provisions they have are not strong enough, because we still have these issues. Every community has issues of rape and defilement. And then they talk about keeping a brothel for prohibited sexual activity. Brothels, Fatima, if you can remind me, are brothels prohibited in Ghana, like at large?
Sex work is very much still criminalized. So again,
Okay.
already covered under the laws as we have it now.
Okay, so it's already covered. However, by singling it out to the queer community, they're essentially telling landlords, don't rent out your apartment to someone who may be queer. So they're now making it possible for the livelihood, or one of the basic needs for people, that is shelter, to be taken away from them. How does this promote human rights? And now another thing which really made me squirm was affiliating or associating homosexuality, putting homosexuality and bestiality in the same category. They do this under provision 6 in Ghana's law. They do this under provision 6, where they essentially lump queerness and bestiality as the same thing. So provision 6, 1A II says sexual intercourse between a man and an animal, or a woman and an animal. And that's right after sexual intercourse among persons of the same sex. So this law lumps being queer and bestiality as one thing, which is very dehumanizing if you think about it. So this whole thing, I see it as a witch hunt. I see it as a witch hunt. And similarly, Uganda propagates the same thing. Uganda actually has the chutzpah to say that we look at colonial laws. Let me quote, "We want to look at this colonial law and have it in tandem with current circumstances and situations. It is behind this background that I beseech you to join in having a new law that addresses this cancer." And this was by Asuman Basaliwa, the MP of Burigi municipality, when they were talking about this bill in Uganda's parliament. He quotes that they are looking at this colonial law. What do you have to say about this?
Very disappointing stuff. For me, the first thing that gives me cause for disappointment is just how shabbily and shoddily the document for this bill was put together. It's like, give us some credits, right? Give us some credits. If you're going to do something as horrible as this, the very least thing that you could do was to do your research. First of all, they have no idea about what the LGBT community is. They don't even know what the letters represent. They don't understand what the identities are. They describe things as what they're not. They equate same-sex loving. They equate it to pedophilia, they equate it to bestiality, they equate it to sex trafficking, they equate it to sexual violence. And it's like there's language for all of these things. And like those are the words that I've literally just mentioned now. And then there's also being queer, the state of being queer. There's also that, right? And it's like you don't even bother to do your research. You don't, you don't know anything. Because why in the world do you have allies in your bill? Like what do you know what the word ally is? Like it's a basic English word. Anybody can be an ally to any cause, right? And then you take that word in a broad stroke and apply it to this specific context. And so now somebody cannot even say I'm an ally anymore because and so for me, like it's so disappointing because these are the people who we have elected. Remember, right? They are elected in this. We said go into parliament to represent our interests. Go into parliament, make sure that we have running water in our taps, make sure that we have access to good roads in our communities. Like you're there to protect our interests. And even if you feel like there's something so horrible about the LGBT community, the least that you could do is actually do your research, understand what this phenomenon is before you decide that you want to draft legislation, right, to annihilate a very significant portion of the country, of the population, because there's multiple things that is happening with the bills, both with the Ugandan bill and with the Ghanaian bill. They are essentially trying to erase people, right? They're trying to erase people's identities. They are trying to disappear people from society. They are trying to push people into homelessness. They are turning families against each other. Because what does it mean when you say that who somebody is fundamentally, right? It's not because you've done anything, just because of the way that you came into this world. Fundamentally, there's something illegal about you, and that your family has a duty to report you to the police. How does this in any way promote any kind of family values? How? Like, if you're saying that I should report my siblings, if you're saying that I should report my father, my mother should report me, what does that even mean, right? There's no care, there's no consideration, there's no analysis of nothing. It's just pure hatred and it's wickedness, right? It's the height of wickedness and just like overall very violent.
I definitely agree with that. And you had briefly mentioned on the existence of queerness within African communities, even though a lot of these people pushing for this witch hunt call it a foreign construct. Now, I know some scholars are sick and tired of having to justify that, yes, queerness exists everywhere. But for listeners who may not be familiar, I would want to ask, in what ways has queerness existed within African spaces? Like, are there some examples that you can give just to enlighten our listeners and also just point them in directions if they want to do more extensive research on this?
The first thing I would say is I am one of those people who hate, that argument of queerness has always existed. Because, and even if it hasn't, right? And so what? Like the people today in the here and now who are African and lesbian, who are African and trans. So then it means that makes it African, right? We don't have to go back to 400 years ago, to see what our ancestors did before we're able to validate identities as they exist in the current moment, right? But even if we were to engage them on that, queerness has always existed on the continent. And it's always very important for me to say that even the construction of gender as we know it today is very much Western. The idea of femininity and masculinity in terms of like gender roles, and women are supposed to be bred homemakers, home nurturers. That whole thing of women are supposed to be home nurturers and men are breadwinners and things like that. That's not how our ancestors lived, right? So because if we're going to talk about queerness, we need to start even from the very basic of gender. How did our parents I mean, how did our ancestors construct gender? What did gender roles look like for them? Were women in, and this is not to say that pre-colonial Africa was like a utopia. There, patriarchy did exist, right? But it just looks very different from what exists now. But the point is, there's always been room for diversity of gender and diversity of gender expression, and sexuality and sexual expression and things like that. So if you look at so from the very very basic, I think for me one of the main things that I always point to me is the fact that the construction of like gender the way that we know it is something that is not it's something that is foreign to African culture, right? Is the way that in many of our African languages we don't have gendered pronouns. We have one pronoun for everybody. That one pronoun is gender neutral. So men, the pronoun applies to men, applies to women, applies to anybody. It's just that one pronoun, right? We don't have like specific, pronouns for men or women, things like that. And then even in terms of like other gendered language, right, to um to describe things that people do. So maybe somebody, an actor and actress. You know how we have all these like gendered things for even for occupations, for instance. We don't have that. It's just one word. Somebody who does this is a this person. Simple. Not a man who does this and a woman who does this. Right. So even when you go on the very basic level, as like what the evidence shows in our language is that there was always space for neutrality or fluidity or whatever there is. And when you go to the northern parts of Ghana, for instance, transness existed. I came across this thread a couple of weeks ago on Twitter that somebody had made. I think they're doing this kind of like photo series, and they had gone to the northern parts of Ghana, and they were talking to a trans woman. She's like I think she's in her 90s now. So it's a photo series of trans elders, and so this is somebody who is in their 80s or 90s in the northern region who is trans, and it's not an issue, and they've been alive for 80 years of their lives. And so even when the legislators of the anti-LGBT bill come and say that the West, quote unquote, is trying to push homosexuality, it's like somebody's 80 years. They've been trans their whole lives. Like, how do you reconcile with that? So in northern Ghana, we have evidence of that, even in terms of like cultural practices. So again, I'm aware of this of a cultural practice that exists where as part of puberty rights, so young men and women and gender non-conforming people, just like basically young people around puberty, they kind of like switch things out. So for the men actually required to stay at home and do all of the domestic things while the women are trained to go out into the forest hunting and gathering and things like that. And the core idea behind that is that there's room for duality for each person. And so the fact that you are of a certain gender doesn't mean that you must be restricted or confined to specific gender roles. So, when you're entering puberty, that's another stage of adulthood. It's like, well, this is an opportunity for you to explore a different side, of what your personhood might be. We have examples of, they call them, we have examples of women, androgynous women who kind of like are seen as a conduit between the physical world and the spiritual world. So, women who they're allowed to grow out their beard, they're very hairy, they just look like what in today's language we would say is a like they're masculine, right? They have all these masculine features, and it's like, but they're also women, but they're also not women, right? And there's language for that in like the very specific cultural languages, but it just doesn't always translate very well into English, right? And so we have examples of these boy wives and female husbands and things like that. So fairness has existed, very much existed in African spaces. In Akan, we have phrases like kojo bisia. Kojo is a word for men or males who are born on Monday. Yes, kojo, yes, born on Monday. And besia means woman. So kojo besia is basically like a woman kojo or a woman man born on Monday. And then, so we have things like oba berima,
Yeah.
Obaberima, how does that translate again?
Oba is female woman and Berma is man, so man woman. So Kojo basically it's pretty much they're just synonymous. It just depends on who's coming first. So if it's a guy, Kojo masculine, then Besia feminine, and then if it's a woman or someone who's female, then it's Oba Berima, so Oba feminine, and then Berima
Berima,
masculine. So
masculine.
they just switch positions depending on the actual physical like the gender of the person or and then how they present.
Right,
So yeah,
right.
yeah.
So,
So
so,
that's
so,
that.
right, exactly. So just, and the point is that, again, for me, the fact that the language exists just only goes to show, and the language has been there for what, centuries, right? It only goes to show that it had existed in like different ways, it looked differently. And so, yeah, that's how I would respond to that, really.
Mm. Yeah, when you brought up the thread, the Twitter thing, I actually saw it and I went to go pull it up because I saw that and I know they exist because in my own research, I had an encounter where a woman in Chi, it was an interview in a soap factory. A woman in Chi was literally telling me, "Oh, hey, wait for me. My husband is on their way so that you can take a picture," because I was taking videos and pictures. And in my head, I'm like, okay, yeah, cool, your boo thing coming, bet. And husband pulls up, and it's another woman. It's another woman, and they literally kiss for the camera. Mind you, none of this was in English. So my translating the word kuno is just to draw that connection to what you're talking about
Right.
language, which actually even takes us to the next question. But before that, the Twitter thread was talking about how the person you're talking about was a guy who looked and behaved so much like a girl that, and I'm reading from the person who conducted the interview, who on Twitter is Papa Kojo. He said, "In fact, my father and most men considered boys like me good charm, and we will accompany them to farms before farming season. They believed we brought good harvest, and we did." So even the understanding of people who were outside the binary was very different. So at what point did that change for people who are outside the binary of male, female to become a threat? At what point did that change? So going back again to the language of question, I believe there's an interesting misunderstanding between the existence of queerness and the language or queerness as we know it mainstream. What do I mean? We agree that queerness has existed pre-colonization and it will continue to exist. However, the specific language or words, that is things like gay, lesbian, homosexual, queer, pansexual, as we see, hear, and read, is from the West. So these particular words are from the West. How do you think this influences the arguments lawmakers make? And is there anything that you can think can be done about the microaggressions towards the West, which end up manifesting as these lawmakers taking it out on the queer community? Because I really feel like they have issues with the West. They have issues with the West, and they take this out on people who end up having labels that have Western connotations to them. What do you think can be done about this? Because right now, I don't think the problem are the people. I think the problem with the lawmakers is the language because they don't really understand.
All of this goes back to colonization, right? And at some point, it starts to sound very tired, right? But that's precisely what happens. Earlier on, you were saying that, all of these things existed. And so what changed? And what changed was colonization, right? Because colonizers came and they saw this thing that was so foreign to them, and they're like, whoa, what is this? We don't do that. So you cannot do that. And that's where, all of this, like, the current homophobic laws that we have, they're all like colonial legacy, right? This is what colonizers left with us, right? And so for me, for me, one, a very big thing is colonization. I think that as Africans on the continent, we have a very big reckoning we need to do as to how deep colonization really, really penetrated the very fabric of the way that we imagine ourselves in our societies, right? Because all of this talk about the language, I don't think the problem really is the language, because there's so many like words from the West that we use anyways, right? That we use anyways. We're eating rice. We're eating pizza. What it's like we're doing all of these things that is so for me, my grandmother. I cannot go and tell her that let's go and eat pizza because she's like, what is that? It's not, it's not from here. But now we use those words and nobody is complaining, right? Our parliamentarians, they're wearing suits, three-piece suits, and they're sitting in parliament. This is not us, right? And all of this has been accepted, right? So why is it that very specific things are being rejected? And I hear what you're saying about microaggressions towards the West. But personally, I don't think that it really applies in this case. I I think that the problem of homophobia in Africa is one, it's Western influence, right? It's a recolonization project. So there's that is happening. But I think that on the side of the lawmakers, I want to think that it's about political power. That's what I want to think that because these lawmakers who are sitting in parliament who are making these laws, they know gay people. They know gay people in their community where they grew up in. They know gay people when they went to school. They know gay people as their lawmakers today. They know people in their lives, and they've never had an issue, right? They've never had an issue with it. But why is it coming out? And again, why is it coming out in legislation, especially when we know that right-wing evangelicals in the US are pumping money into Africa? They're doing conferences with MPs, they're meeting secretly with MPs, they are funding churches to push homophobic agendas. Right? We know all of these things is happening. So again, so my thing is, if lawmakers really and truly feel a type of way about those, why are you collecting their money? Why are you collecting their money? I came across research, I think, what was this, by Open Democracy or something, and then they were saying since 2017, I think, that more than 20 US-based groups known for fighting against LGBT rights and abortion rights have channeled about $54 million into African countries since 2007. So it's like our lawmakers have been accepting. Where is that $54 million going, right? They're accepting it. So if you have an issue with the West, why are you taking the money? So I don't want to think that the issue is with the West. I want to think that the issue is that is what riles the people up, right? Because we have a problem of religious homophobia, which again, the religion is we inherited from colonization. People are very much afraid of what they don't know. And if you tell somebody, and mind you, right, mind you, the dysfunctional states of our countries, right, in Ghana, the pregnant women in hospitals, they don't have beds. Like people are delivering on the floor, like you're pushing your baby out on the floor. So if you live in a society or in a country that doesn't work, God is the only, that's the only thing, that's the last hope for you because you cannot have faith in your leaders. So God is the last person or the last thing or whatever to come through for you, right? And so people are very deep in the trenches of religion. And the country is bad enough as it is. So when you're telling people that if you think things are bad in Ghana, if you think things are bad in Uganda, when you legalize homosexuality, it will be worse. Of course, they're going to be afraid. Of course, they're going to be worried. And then the politicians, they play on this, right? They are playing on a fear that they themselves have created due to their own incompetence and their own greed, right? To further manipulate people into maligning or marginalizing like their own people, like their own fellow citizens and their own neighbors and brothers and friends and things like that. So like that's what is happening. And so every time that the issue of homosexuality happens, is usually it becomes like a partisan thing. And this is very specific, to Africa, I'm saying. So again, if you take the bill that is happening in Ghana right now, the people who are pushing this bill. So first of all, it's a private members bill, right? So it's not like it was parliament on their own that they said, it was just 8 members of parliament who said, oh, the government said as MPs we can independently push bills. We've looked in the community, and this is the issue that we think that we want to push. If you look at the people who are kind of spearheading this, they're members of the opposition. And they use that to threaten the sitting government to say, look, if you guys don't pass this bill, we're going to vote you out. if you don't pass this bill, everybody's going to know that your government is the government that encourages homosexuality. And so when things go wrong, aka when we come into power and things go wrong, it will be your fault because it was in your time, that you allow this thing to pass. And then what do we see? We also see the religious leaders also threatening, the MPs, saying that when it's time to vote for this bill in parliament, we're going to make it an open ballot. Everybody would know what you voted for, and people will not vote for you again. So it's like, if really it's God who doesn't like this, I like to think that God is powerful enough to, fight their own battles themselves. They don't need to threaten anybody and push people beyond what they're comfortable with, right? And so for me, I really want to maintain, because I don't want our leaders to get away with, trying to do like, oh, we don't have that much power, or it's above us. It's very, very much in their hands. They have the power to stop this if they really wanted to, right? But it's a game. It's a thing of, oh, we're in opposition, so we're going to push this thing. When we're in power, we will be silent about it. When we go back into opposition, election time is coming next week. Okay, what do we need to rile people up, right? So, and that's what is happening. That's what we see, happening. It always comes with threats and things like that.
Yeah.
And so for me, I really I don't even want to hear that. Oh, it's because our leaders they're so decolonized and they're so anti. They believe so much in sovereignty. Because again, if you're going begging for aid, like you're begging for aid, and the IMF, they're giving you all this conditions that will make life more difficult for people. You're happy to accept it. So your problem really is not that. Your problem is not that your problem is not the West. Like, your problem is not the West. Your problem is that you want to continue to consolidate power within your own home country, and you're willing to use the LGBT community as pawns, to further push this.
Yeah,
is that
as
what
target,
it is? And we
as
need to be
bait.
real about it, be honest about it.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So we've talked about like the bleak part of it, but I believe that when we're talking about when we're having conversations about marginalized groups, it's also important that we talk about the resistance, because we are not just there. The queer community is not just there dormant doing nothing. So as unfortunate as the situation is, queer people and allies have not been quiet. An article found by my amazing colleague Basil Opoti shows Ugandan mothers advocating for the annulment of the bill. And I'm going to read part of the statement. So it says, as parents of LGBTQ plus individuals, we are not promoters of any agenda. We are Ugandan mothers who have had to overcome many of our own biases to fully understand, accept, and love our children. We have always known that our children are different from a young age, and in many ways tried to turn them onto the path that we felt would be safer, a path of conformity to a norm that we now understand is not innate to LGBTQ plus children. We tried all means necessary, including prayer, recrimination, and different forms of punishment to force them onto the path that we selfishly thought would be right for them and us. In the process of doing so, we were inadvertently threatening to take away the only refuge that a child has, a safe and loving home, free of violence, unrealistic expectations, and hate. Home is more than just structures. It is a safe haven and refuge of love, learning, and belonging. Just like our children did not choose to be LGBTQ+, we too did not choose to be parents of LGBTQ+ children, but we have chosen to love our children for who they are. As parents, we all desire and work to ensure that our children are healthy, well-educated, successful, and fulfilled in both their professional and personal lives. We fear that our children are going to be targets of mob violence, which is a direct consequence of living in a country whose legislators are recklessly legalizing homophobia and transphobia with this anti-homosexuality law. This is deep. This is very deep, and it's refreshing. It's refreshingly deep. What are your thoughts on this, Fatima?
When I saw that letter, I read it, I cried. Because it's as you said, it's refreshingly deep. It's like, wow, like what kind of love is this, right? Because again, that's the thing that we all aspire to, that our parents will stand solidly behind us, regardless of whatever, that they're willing to stand up against the state to say, no, I will not let you do this to my child. And so for me, I was really touched. And it says a lot. It says a lot about our capacity to resist. And that's one of the things that gives me hope, in spite of all of these things happening, queer people and people who love queer people, they're not sitting down and folding their arms. They're actively resisting. Um, Activists, since all of this talk about the bill and all of this talk about criminalization, grassroots activists are rallying, they're fundraising, they're mobilizing. They're like, do you need a place to stay? Are you worried that you're going to be targeted at home or at your workplace? There's mutual aid happening. People are providing support. People are like, oh, come to my place. Somebody is texting me, saying, oh, I have a spare room in my house. Please let any, queer person know that if they don't feel safe at this moment, they can come and lodge here for a while. Somebody's like, oh, I want to donate money. What organizations do you want to recommend? And then activists, they're putting their lives on the line every single day. In Ghana, when there was a call for people to present memos on, basically arguments on whether or not the bill should be passed. Activists were there, in parliament, in front of the camera, saying that here, I'm gay, and I'm against this. Like it's bravery of the highest kind. It's the kind of bravery that we expect from lawmakers. And we're not seeing from them. And these are people who they know that by doing this, they could die the next moment. Like you can literally step outside of parliament doors and you'll be gunned down, right? But they're doing it regardless, and that gives me hope. And it's annoying, that you have to be ready to die to be able to live. It makes no sense. That's not what we signed up for. When we said we're citizens of Ghana, we're paying our taxes and we're doing all the things required of us by law. You did not sign to be a target. You didn't sign to basically have to fight to be seen as human. But that's what is happening. And so across the continent, even I think one of the things that have been very, very touching to see also has been the show of solidarity of different organizations across the continent saying, oh, when we were in a similar situation in Kenya, this was what we did. We have resources. I think the most touching thing to see has been the show of solidarity of organizations across the continent, reaching out saying, well, we have resources, when we're, in Kenya, we're faced with a similar situation. This was what we did. Do you want us to share strategies with you? Do you want us to share resources? Do you want us to protest? What do you want us to do? And then, of course, even across the diaspora as well, right? So there's, continental solidarity, but even across the diaspora, it's like Ghanaians in the UK are saying we're going to, the High Commission, we're going to petition the Commissioner, we're going to say that, Ghanaians in the UK, we're against this bill, basically. And so that has been very touching to see. Last year, I think when the bill first came out, there was this statement that was signed. But I think it was signed by some celebrities, Naomi Campbell and Edward Enwinfo and co. And for me, it's like those things gave me hope to know that we're not alone in this fight, and that even though the state that has a mandate to protect us, the state that has a mandate to see each and every one of us as equal, before the law, each and to humanize us, if the state has decided to target certain people for violence, it's always refreshing to know that there are also other people who are willing to stand up to the state. And so for me, that's what gives me courage to continue, even though sometimes it's hard and you're tired. And then you see somebody else, I look to people like Angel Maxine. She's making song after song. She's making all these hits. She's like, I'm ready to die for this thing that I believe in. And to see Angel Maxine's mother also saying, but I stand by my child. This is my child, and I stand by her. And that gives me courage to continue. And it also makes me, it's like this is the kind of thing that we should all aspire to. We should all aspire to caring so deeply about the survival of other people because really and free. Like if I'm not free, you cannot be free. And if somebody is not free, I cannot be free. Like our freedom is tied to the freedom of other people. And the sooner that we realize it, the better for us really.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Oh my God. I'm glad you brought up the thing about solidarity with the UK Commission. I think that was also happening with the Uganda bill. When it got passed, diasporic Ugandans were against this. There were some, I think, rallies in Uganda, but then it's very dicey because their president already had signed a few years ago, had signed the bill, but it got rebutted because they did not go through the proper constitutional processes. So this time they were trying to like dot their I's and cross their T's. So, right, I don't know if the president of Uganda has signed it or if he's in the process, but this is the last straw and we hope he doesn't. Now, the organizations that we talked about, are there some that you can name, some that have been active really both on Uganda's end and Ghana's end, but also just for listeners to know, Kamala Harris was in Ghana not long ago. And as an ally of the queer community, she brought up this issue in conversation with our president, Nana Akufo-Addo. And yes, you can Google that interaction and see the response and make your create your own opinions based off that. But it was really, again, refreshing to see allyship around the community. And so Kamala did that. 2 snaps for her. But going back again to community orgs that are on the ground, neck deep, doing this kind of work. Can you name some of them so people can also acquaint themselves to their work?
The only organization that I would mention, because they are the most visible and they, we're kind of like in the center of all of this, is LGBT plus rights Ghana.
If people want to support communities, queer communities on the continent, in Uganda, in Ghana, what are some ways you can suggest they do this? Whether the support is in cash or in kind or through pointing other people to resources, how would they be able, where's the starting point for people who have no idea where to start?
I think the starting point is, so there are some organizations that are okay with being visible, like LGBT rights Ghana, for instance. So you find those organizations that are visible because their information is already out there. And then you can send them a message saying, hey, I'm so and so, I'm looking to support the community. What would you suggest? And then they would kind of like say, well, we have this project, so we're collaborating with this other organization. So and that's the thing about allyship. It requires you to go the extra mile to really find out who is in need of support. So I would say look out for the already visible ones and then get in touch with them.
Okay, awesome. So listeners, if you want to support, please reach out to the visible communities like LGBT Rights Ghana. They are very visible and they're easy to communicate with. So please do that. We've talked about the queer community a lot, but I forgot to ask you, why should people who are not queer actually care about these laws?
Because we have a moral obligation as human beings to speak up against injustice. I'm not going to be one of those people who say, oh, because your brother could be queer or your mother. You don't need to know any queer person in your life for you to stand up against what is wrong. And so we do have a moral obligation, in case you didn't know before, to stand up against any form of injustice. It's as simple as that. So if you're not queer, you should care because the other human beings are suffering. That should be enough.
Yes. And let me add some icing to that cake. So some of the provisions that were made in, was it Ghana's law when it was pretty much banning unnatural carnal knowledge, pretty much meant everything that was not intercourse. And so intercourse is defined as the penetration of the male genitalia into the female genitalia. So any other form of encounter is deemed as unnatural. Now, with some education about sexual pleasure, you realize that's not the only way sexual pleasure is derived. And so queer people And homosexuals are not the only people who engage in sexual relations that do not specifically require intercourse. So heterosexual people, think through your sexual pleasure practices and see how this law implicates you, because by this law, your activities become illegal. So yeah, these are some of the loopholes in the bill's provisions that I just wanted to throw out there, just to also emphasize how absurd it is. So if you don't think you have a moral obligation, look at how you're actually implicated by these provisions and then rethink your stance on your moral obligation to the world. Now, before we go, I know that you do a lot of writing. Are there any books that you would like to recommend to our listeners?
I would say read The Sex Lives of African Women by Nana Kwesi. It's a must read. Everybody must read that. Yes.
Yes. Yes. I concur. I support that statement. Thank you so much, Fatima, for being here. Thank you for this conversation. And lastly, if people would like to keep up with your work, what's the best way for them to do this?
I am very active on Twitter. My Twitter account is just Derby, JUSTDERBY. I share a lot about what's happening. I amplify the work other people are doing. So my Twitter for now, I think. Thank you too for the invitation. I was glad to be here. It was really good to talk to you, Ami.
All right, awesome. So thank you for tuning in, listeners, and we hope you enjoy this episode. We will see you again later on another episode. Have a lovely day. Bye.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Ufahamu Africa. You can find more episodes, show notes, and transcripts on our website, ufahamuafrica.com. This podcast is produced and managed by Megan DeMint, with help from production assistants Chukwufunanya Ikechukwu, Alex Kozak, and Ami Tamakloe. Our non-resident podcast fellows are Bamba Njaye, Maseke Rioba, Takono Priscilla Sempere, and Kamohelo Tuniko Toletti. We are generously supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York and receive research assistance from Cornell University and the University of California, Riverside. Our music is courtesy of Kevin McLeod. Until next week, Safiri Salama.